Let's begin. My name is Jess and I'm from Canva Design School. So we're very excited to have brought together 4 data experts from Canva today for this session. It's an action-packed workshop on storytelling with data using Canva. So it's over to you, Zoe, to kick us off.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I'm a data analyst at Canva.
Hi, my name's Mo. I'm one of the data leads here at Canva. I'm super passionate about this topic, which you'll figure out as we get along.
For those who are new to Canva, we are a graphic design platform that makes it easy to design anything for free. Our mission is to empower the world to design. And today we're going to be talking about data visualization. Data viz is the graphical representation of numbers, or combining and representing many data points into a compelling graph. Data visualization simplifies complex statistics while making sure the information is visually appealing. The key takeaway that we want you to get from this workshop today is that data visualization tells a story. One of the coolest things to happen in the light of COVID was the data-driven news articles about the pandemic. In this video, the New York Times used a visualization technique called scrollytelling to visualize the outbreak over 2 dimensions, time and geography. In early 2020, I worked in a COVID-19 dataset, combining national and subnational statistics on the impact of the pandemic in the US and in Australia. At the time, even now, just finding all of this information was challenging. Compiling it into one location made sense, but the question remained, how do we best represent it? We can put all of these numbers into a table, but this is often quite confusing. I decided to visualize it instead, and that really got the message across. A year ago, we could see quite clearly that COVID was hitting the US quite hard, especially compared to Australia. In this session, we will cover some of the main questions we are often asked and prep you on what you should do before you even start. We will dive into the concept of the data-ink ratio and why emphasizing data itself is the most important part of this workshop. We will give you some solid tips on when to use different types of charts. And lastly, we will go into some practical examples of how you can use Canva to make beautiful graphs.
Okay, so before we get started, I just wanted to share that all of the examples and ideas that we're presenting are not our own. There is a wealth of information on this topic where both Zoe and I have learned everything that we're sharing today. So these 4 books are my absolute Bibles when it comes to data visualization. Stephen Few's Information Dashboard Design, Cole Knaflick, former Google employee, Storytelling with Data, and then Nancy Duarte, who's like my professional crush, wrote the 2 books, Slidology and Data Story, and they are just phenomenal resources. And then there's also a couple people in the industry that I'm really close with that their work has really shaped my own understanding of this topic. So on the left, we have Tim Wilson, who works at Search Discovery. He has a really great course at cxl.com. My sister actually works in data as well, so she's a really great resource for me to bounce off, and she has some amazing training that you can access as well. And then Leah Pika has, a whole website and blog and podcast dedicated to this topic. And then Nancy Duarte, she's my main gal. We actually had her as a guest on a podcast I host all about data viz. So there's lots of resources that you can use. We do have a real data family. Okay, so let's jump into the actual content. And the first thing that we want to talk about is where you should start. So there's a reason that we share data. And it's normally because we want people to think about what we're going to do with this information and not what does it mean. So I've got a little pop quiz. It's not a trick question, so don't freak out. It's a very simple little task. Now, when I flick to the next slide, all I want you to do is count the number of 5s. Excellent. Now, what I want you to do before we move on is think about how long that task took you. Did it take you 10 seconds, 20 seconds? Are you still counting? Which is okay too. Now I want you to do the same thing on the next slide. And you'll probably notice it took you a fraction of the time. Now, this is what data viz is all about. See, 3 seconds, nice, excellent. So it doesn't matter if data is pretty, does it? But the thing is, it's not about looking good. It's about being understood. So I think people get really excited about data viz, but the truth is it's about helping your audience get there. So this is a really ugly spreadsheet. As a data analyst, this is how I spend lots of my time. I had a former executive that I used to work with who was often a bit impatient when it came to getting the numbers. And on this particular day, she messages me and it's like, okay, Mo, like, do you have the data for me? Send it through. And I said to her, I was like, I'll send it by the end of the day. Like, give me a couple hours. I'm just, putting it together and presenting it. Yep. I see Adrian shares my love of spreadsheets. And yeah, she was putting a lot of pressure on me, and against my better judgment, I sent her the spreadsheet. And within the minutes, I had a wall of text in Slack. I mean, she came back with every question under the sun. How does the US compare to other countries? Like, how does, what was our best week? What was our worst week? Is this a good LTV or a bad LTV? And this is exactly why we spend time doing data viz, is because that myriad of questions is actually what we're trying to answer and avoid. When we send data, the last thing we want is to have people be left with more questions. So really the goal here is to reduce the cognitive load or the mental energy needed by our audience to understand data. So the first thing we're going to do before we even think about pulling data into a presentation or an email is we're going to start with some basic questions. So firstly, I want you to think about your audience and how data literate are they? So ideally, when we do any type of presentation or we communicate results, we really want to have the content focusing on the least data literate member of your audience. So there's always people that need extra information, and the appendix is your friend in that case. You just shove it right at the back, add it to the appendix. But when it comes to the actual core content, you need to focus on the least data literate member of your audience. So what's the level of detail that they need? Is rounded numbers okay? Or am I sharing with finance people that probably need a higher level of precision? How does each data point I'm including contribute to my story? So sometimes as a data analyst, we even include the same graph twice if we're using it to highlight a different point that we're making. So you really need to be thoughtful about what you include.
Data doesn't always equal flashy charts. In fact, just because you have data, it doesn't actually mean that it should be in a graph. Sometimes a great infographic is a better way to display your point. We're going to talk about this more later in this session. And the most important part of this whole process is taking time to think about what you can remove from your presentation or document. Often when we have worked so hard and gotten so deep into the detail, we think that everything needs that level of detail, and it doesn't. So if you have stakeholders who like a lot of information and a lot of detail, just add it to the appendix for them. Most importantly, you should have a really clear call to action. If the whole way through your work, you think about what action you want them to take, you can never go wrong.
So another really good technique before you get started is to think about using wireframes. This is something that I use for pretty much everything that I build. Basically, like, I'm old school, I love a post-it note, but I also do mock-ups in Canva as well. But basically you want to think about each data point so that you can, like, this is why I like Post-it, you can kind of move it around, and not to scare you all, but this was the process of putting this exact slide deck together. I kind of went through and we had every single point that we wanted to share on a Post-it, and then you can clump it into themes and like really move it around and make sure you get the right structure. And I even do this for our dashboards. When I'm making dashboards, I'll make a wireframe first and check with our stakeholders that it has all the things that they need. So just to recap quickly, before you even get started, give some thought to these questions. Who is my audience? How does each data point contribute to the story that you're trying to share? What can you remove? And most importantly, what actions do you want them to take? And then lastly, if you wireframe things, it's always a bit of extra work, but it will make sure that things have a really great flow. Okay, on to my favorite, this is my favorite part, emphasizing what matters. So the McKinsey title is hands down my favorite kind of title. Lots of people call it an insights title. So what often happens when people add a chart to a slide is that they will use the title of the graph as the title of their slide. So this is a really good example, right? Annual revenue by year, which, I mean, most people can figure it out if you look at the graph long enough. Now, the problem with this particular, I guess, tendency that people have is that people pay the most attention to the title and it actually has the least important information. So what we instead want to do is create what we call an insights title, which tells your audience exactly why you included this graph. So here, let's say 2017 was our best year, but 2021 might finish ahead based on current performance. So by changing the title of the slide to the insight, you're actually helping people reach that conclusion very quickly about why you included this graph. It's actually supplementing the information. And think about what your brain did when this slide popped up. I bet that the first thing it did was read that title before it even took in the graph. Okay, another little exercise. So when we go to the next slide, all I want you to do is to read it. So that's it. So the majority of people will have read the text in the order that I've specified here. And this is exactly why this insights title is so important. Oh, yes, I love that, everyone. Okay, because sometimes you do have some outliers, as we know with our data. But this is the reason that we really want to avoid having big blocks of text on your slides, because people will also try and read everything that you put on the slide. So by making your insights title the most important and clearly read information on your slide, it will really drive home the point. Now, when I coach junior staff, I actually tell them to do the same thing in emails or Slack messages when they're communicating data, because people will try and skim read. That's just how our brains work. So when we communicate in like a written format with a lot of text, I'll encourage people to still use these insights headings at the top of their paragraphs. So like your takeaway 1, 2, and 3, have a really clear call to action. And I always start an email or a big block of text with a TLDR at the start. Okay, so the next important ratio we're going to talk about is the data inc ratio. It is just, I mean, this concept will change your whole life. It's changed mine. So Edward Tufte first came up with this term in 1983, which was a fair while ago. And it's really a core concept of data visualization, which basically says that everything on a page which isn't data should be minimized or removed. I've just seen that Gretchen's asked, TLDR is too long, don't read, but that is a very good reason for why you should never use acronyms in a presentation. But back to the data inc ratio. So anything that's not data, we want to minimize or remove. So what we want to do is save any ink that you use for your data. Now, this is where having a family member in the industry really helps, because my sister always reminds me that if you're struggling with this concept, pretend your printer is running out of ink. So if you only have a limited amount of ink, you want to make sure that it is used for the core pieces of information on your slide.
So we have another pop quiz for you all, and this one is actually about a graph. So I'm going to present 2 graphs, and I want you all to write in the chat which one you prefer. Chart A or chart B? Yeah, a lot of people are going with B. That's great. Chart A is okay, but I think following along with the data inc ratio, you can see that there are some things that we want to remove here. Let's chat through why most people prefer chart B and some techniques we can use to go from chart A to chart B. On this graph, basically everything that is red can either be removed or minimized. So the first thing I do on every graph is remove the grid lines and any borders. And in a simple graph like this, we don't really need the legend either. So let's remove that. The really nice thing about Canva is a lot of these types of errors, they're the default in a lot of different charting programs like Google Sheets or Excel, but that just doesn't exist in Canva. Already by doing that, by removing the axes, by removing the grid line in the legend, you can see how much clearer the information is. So we're going to clean up the axes points and labeled on the graph to make it easier to read and to use less ink. Notice that the number of date values that we have below is just way too many for our eye to kind of pass quickly. You don't need to have a number for every single point on the axes. Often if you just have like a gap of, say, every 2 weeks you plot the date, that's totally fine. And then the unit of measurement on the y-axis is also kind of crazy, as it requires people to compute how many zeros there are in the number to make sense of the data. So often it's better to shorten that label. Let's say you have our y-axis that goes into the millions. It can just be better to write, 1 million, 1M, 10M, and so on.
So we also don't want to make people read sideways. So this is a thing that happens by default in almost every charting tool, which is really frustrating to data analysts. And by just taking a quick second to fix this, you'll notice that the graph is much easier for the audience to understand. So some of the things that Zoe just touched on, we've changed here. You'll notice that the date, for example, now we've just done August of each year instead of having every single month. We've also rotated the labels, which makes it much easier to read. And then we've also, you'll see on the y-axis, rather than having all of those zeros, we've now started using notations of like 100 million. Another nice little touch that you can use is that you can put the unit of measurement at the top of the axis label. So see how I have revenue and then the dollar sign? That tells us that we're talking about dollars, which means that you don't need to repeat the dollar sign on every single axis tick. Oh, I love that people are also talking about color blindness, because it's actually really important. It's not something we go into today, but it's a really important concept in data visualization. So one last little touch that I've added here is that most charting tools will also default to making your axis black. Now, black, believe it or not, like you won't notice a really big change. I'm actually going to flip back to this slide again, just to show you. So you can see the black here on the axis labels and on the revenue title. And then when we go back to this slide, it's actually just a dark gray. So it just lightens it up a little bit. And what you'll notice is it actually forces your eye to travel along the graph quicker and straight to that label where we've identified the point of interest. So it's a really good hack to change things from black to a dark gray whenever you're building out a graph. So what you'll notice is here is that in a couple of very simple steps, and they're very simple, you can go from this chart on the left, which is pretty hideous to look at, to this chart on the right. Okay, so the next point we're going to talk about is using the minimum information that you need to make your point. So often when we're talking about data, people want to include complexity because there'll be this certain pain in the backside stakeholder who asks for it, or because you're so in the detail, you think you need that complexity, but it's not normally the case. So let's take a look at this slide. Let's say we want to draw a point about overall revenue of the company. So revenue will surpass 100 million by the end of the financial year. People will include levels of detail. Like here we have our revenue broken down by the different products that we sell. The problem with this is that the minute that you start including these breakdowns, people will try and interpret them and also try and form a relationship between these products and the insight that you've shared. So people will be looking at the legend and the colors and the title, and there'll be a lot of compute power going on in people's minds that we just don't need. So since we're talking about overall company revenue, we don't need this breakdown. So instead, we're just going to get rid of those categories. That level of complexity was not needed. So all we've done here is just clean up the slide by removing the categories, added our insights headline, and you'll see that you probably reach that conclusion a lot quicker in your mind. Now, don't be afraid of a little white space. It's actually something we can learn a lot from our UX designers. I know, like with app design now, like it's all about, minimum design components, and it's all very beautiful. And the same is true for data visualization. So speaking of designers, there are actually lots of design techniques that we can steal, beg, or borrow from our designers to emphasize what matters. So let's go into a little bit more detail about this. So you might have already picked up a little bit on color, because that is something that we've already highlighted. So you might have noticed in this example that I shared earlier, I've actually used color to highlight what I want my audience to focus on. So in this particular slide, I was making a comparison between 2017 and 2021 year to date. So I've actually used color to highlight those two bars, because while the other years are important from a reference point, they're not actually the focal point of the argument that I'm making. As we saw on this particular slide, if you use too much color, the audience won't actually pay attention to anything. It can be really overwhelming. And as we've all been talking about in the chat, it's also really bad from an accessibility perspective. So this is actually the exact same chart. So let's say we did need that breakdown of different products, but I'm trying to draw my audience to the point that product A is continuing to drive the majority of our revenue. Here we've used that purple color to highlight the bit that we want people to focus on, including the other product components might be important as supplementary information, but we'll just grayed out because we don't want people to focus on it. So actually, as an analyst, what I do is I change everything to grayscale as soon as I start working with it, because as soon as you create a chart, most tools will just throw color at you just immediately. And I just change it to grayscale. And then I only add color back in once I know what point I want to emphasize. So it's really like a superpower that you can use.
Saturation or transparency is another trick that we can use to get people to focus on particular things or data points that we want to emphasize. This is why we make the axes labels and tick marks a dark gray rather than black. It takes the focus away from the data points, away from the axes labels to the important part of your chart, which is the data itself. Saturation is a really good technique to use for time. So we make the most important information the darkest and get progressively lighter as we go back in time. So when you do use color, make sure that you keep it consistent. For example, let's say that we have 3 different product lines. If you use blue on your first graph for product A and purple for product B, make sure you keep those colors the exact same for every single product on every single graph that you share. This avoids people needing to reinterpret a legend and will help them understand the information faster. This is also a great technique to use in dashboards. Another tip is if you are showing a lot of similar graphs and you're able to reuse your scale and your position on the slide, this is another tip that will help your audience understand your data quickly.
So shape is also another design technique that we can leverage to get people to focus on the data point that's of most interest. So here we just have a simple scatter plot, and you'll see that we have this particular outlier up the top. And so if I want to call this out, instead of making it a circle, I just make it a triangle or whatever it is. And if you really want to draw focus, you can use color to your advantage here. So you could make it white, or I've included like a small white border here as well. So just to recap, make sure you use an insights title on your slides. That is the #1 thing you should take away. Save the ink for your data. So anything on your slide which is not data, just remove it or minimize it as much as possible using light gray. Use the simplest info possible. So really think about the breakdowns that you need. And if you can make complex information simple, just do it. It'll save your audience a lot. Keep colors and scales consistent, absolutely where possible. Like I know that in some cases this isn't possible, but where you can, it makes it a lot easier on your audience. And then we can use color, saturation, and shape to emphasize. Okay, what chart to use when? So hopefully by now you're kind of picking up that the way we visualize data can make it easier for our brains to understand quickly. So the first thing I want you to do is consider your grammar. Okay, I'm kind of being a little bit funny here. I'm more talking about your commas and your decimal places. So let's look at this table on the left. Lots of times you will use tables to communicate data. And now we know from the data ink ratio that those grid lines and borders that we have on our table on the left are just completely unnecessary. So we're going to go ahead and remove those. You'll also notice another concept from the data ink ratio is that the topic headings like month and revenue shouldn't be bold because it's a waste of our ink. But importantly, we're actually going to round our numbers. People have a tendency that whatever the data is, that they just dump it straight into their chart or their table. But most audience members don't need 2 decimal places. Like there is almost almost 0 times, unless you're talking to a finance person, that you need 2 decimal places on any slide ever. So using those commas makes it a lot easier, and then the rounding. The other little tip that I will just highlight here that you might not have picked on quite yet is that I've also, in the table on the right, I've right aligned everything. Now, right aligning is really important because what our eyes do when they see numbers in this format is they scan them quickly to try and figure out the width, because the width will help you determine what is the biggest number. So if you look at the table again on the left, you'll notice it's really hard to identify the biggest number because they're center aligned. Now, if you can, I mean, commas are great, but if you can use notations, so like K for thousands, M for millions, B for billions, if you're that lucky. Again, you do need to give some thought to your audience and whether they need that level of precision. Most times people don't, but there are certain cases where you can't use notations. So you're probably thinking we've told you like a lot of things to not do, but now you're kind of like, well, what should I do? And when should I use each type of graph? So the bar chart. Now, if you hang out with lots of data analysts, they love a bar chart and a line chart. They are super boring, but they are also the simplest graphs for people to understand. And it's because it's very easy to make a quick comparison when you're looking at a bar chart. I mean, hands down, this is probably the most used chart that I have. You'll probably notice that today's slide deck was full of bar charts because it's just so easy to make quick comparisons. Now, a point to note is that bar charts should always start at 0. Now, thankfully, Canva does this by default, so it's pretty hard to make this mistake in Canva, but just in case you're making charts in any Traderous other tools, I'll explain why. So this is an example from Cole Knaflich's book that was actually shared during one of the US elections. And a particular news agency on the left, who shall remain nameless, shared this graph basically to try and emphasize a point. But what you'll notice is that it actually just distorts the information. So if you have a data analyst or you're working with someone in data, this is like a big no-no because we want to make sure we're accurately representing the information. So we would always use the bar chart on the right so that we have 0 as the starting point of our bars. Now, if you want to have particularly long or wordy category labels, that's where I would swap to a horizontal bar chart. These are very, very good for surveys. You'll see here, like this is typically what we use when we're using our internal survey results. And this goes back to my rule that I shared with you before, which is about never making people read sideways. So by swapping it to a horizontal chart, it makes it really easy to digest.
Similar to a bar chart, we have progress charts, and they're a great way to show how far you are from reaching a goal or meeting a target. As you can see here, we have 3 small charts that show, how much investment, revenue, and profit this hypothetical startup has made. So if you work with an analyst, you will eventually find out about their deep love for line charts. In fact, I have dashboards that are just all line charts. And the reason being is that they are, hands down, the easiest way to compare a trend and compare things like year-on-year statistics. Another tip with regard to line chart is I really like removing the legend and putting labels directly onto the lines. It saves people's eyes from moving back and forth to the legend and then matching up a color or a shape to that specific point on the graph. If it's right there, you know what that line refers to. So next pop quiz. On the next slide, I would like you to look at the area of the 2 circles. How many times bigger is the second one?
A few guesses coming through. 15 times, 10 times, 12 times, 5 times. People are not sure about this one. There's a lot of confusion coming through. Very different answers.
We can obviously tell that the circle on the right is bigger, but how much bigger is it? We tend to underestimate area, which is why you need to be a little bit wary of area graphs. And personally myself, I would avoid using them. So the answer is the right circle is 11 times bigger. And the truth is, our brains really struggle with understanding area and how much bigger one point is compared to another. And, this is really similar to when your partner often struggles to find like the right size Tupperware container for leftovers or something like that. Like we just don't have an intuitive grasp of how big something needs to be.
Okay, I saw someone pop in a comment about pie charts, and I'm so glad because all data presentations really talk about data analysts hating on pie charts. Now, data people hate pie charts, and the reason you hear us go on and on about it is, and then donut charts are even worse, just to be clear, like a lot worse. So let's go into why. So here we have a very simple pie chart. Look, they're pretty, designers like them because they look cool. But what happens when we look at a pie chart is we need to compare angles and area, which is actually really hard for our mind to do, especially quickly. So take a look at the bottom of this graph, for example, and try and compare the second and the third pieces of the pie and try and make a guesstimate about how different they are in terms of size. Now, look, I've been a little bit mean. It does help if you add labels like this. It makes it a lot easier to understand. But let's just take a minute and look at this graph. So we have competitor A, B, D, E, we have us. So let's say we're talking about us versus our competitor. It probably took you almost as long as I've been talking to figure out where we stood versus our competitors, right? Like it took a bit of computing power. Now, this is the exact same information, but it probably took your brain only a couple of seconds to be like, okay, this is where we stand. We're sitting at third. This is where competitor A and B are. This is where competitor D and E are. And it just was much easier for you to draw a conclusion. So while pie charts are very, very pretty, they're really hard to understand. So we tend to avoid them at all costs if we're a data analyst. Now, if you really, really, really insist on using one, which some people do, this is the only acceptable way to use one. So this is basically is a simple share of totals. So if you're talking about something like penetration rate, addressable market, and you want to talk about a category as a percentage of a whole. So let's say we have us versus the total addressable market.
So the last point we'll be talking about today in terms of offering tips is infographics. So infographics are a great way to pull out key data points. In this infographic, we can see, it's a hypothetical situation, but we can see that 80% of staff feel fulfilled by their job. One last point that we want to emphasize is that infographics are a great way to represent the voice of the user. It's a really nice way to pull together quantitative and qualitative data together, and it will often win over sections of your audience who are a little bit data skeptical. So as an example here, taking that previous infographic where 80% of staff feel fulfilled by their job, and then we have a quote next to it that says, "I still feel like I pinch myself now that I work here. I've never felt so motivated or inspired before." So infographics are a great way to tie together some of those open-ended qualitative data points with quantitative metrics. Just to recap, we've covered things like notations, bar charts for comparison, line charts for trends. We've also gone into a little bit about why pie and donut charts are evil. And we've spoken a little bit about how the voice of the customer is really important for driving your key point home.
Fantastic. Now it's time to welcome Michelle and Tyler for the second part of our presentation, which is part 4, how Canva can help. So we'll just do a bit of a swap and we'll hand over to Michelle.
Hi, my name is Michelle. I am a software engineer at Canva. And one of the projects that I worked on last year was called infographic charts, which ties in nicely with where Zoe left off. But I'll speak more to that a bit later, and I will now pass over to Tyler.
Thanks, Michelle. My name is Tyler. I'm a product manager working at Canva. I've been working at Canva for the last year on the data visualization and charts products. Canva's mission is to empower everyone in the world to design anything. For data visualization, that means building powerful yet simple tools that allow anyone to create beautiful data visualizations. As Zoe and Moe mentioned before, data visualization is more than just adding a chart to the slide. It's about using data to tell a story or clearly communicate an idea. The real magic of creating data visualizations on Canva is having both the ability to use our powerful design tools as well as easy to use data tools. Together, they can be used to help craft impactful visualizations that are easy for anyone to understand. A really common way on Canva is starting with a template. So you can use our library of thousands of templates of different styles, types, and languages, and find whatever fits you best. All you need is to search, use our search tools and apply and update with your data and text. Or if you want to start from scratch, Canva has intelligent chart elements that can be added to any design. Our charts allow you to add your data, restyle, and be used in any design, whether pitch deck or Instagram marketing posts. Our most popular chart elements are bar charts and, sadly, pie charts. But we also are adding more chart types like scatter plots, histograms, and keep your eye out for even more. Our data-heavy charts, Canva makes it simple to add and modify your data. You can paste data in from any source like Excel or type it in yourself. We also have the ability to connect charts directly to Google Sheets. You can select the sheet and data range you want to use, then the chart can be updated with one button. On the next slide, I'll go through a quick demo of how you can create a visualization using a template and link that data to Google Sheets. So first, I'm adding a blank slide to my presentation, starting that way. And then instead of manually adding a chart element, I'll use a template that already matches the style of my presentation. I find and apply the template that looks the closest to what I had in mind. The template has some elements that I don't want in my final design, so I'll remove them and increase the size of the chart to fill the empty space and update the text to my own. I prefer a column chart with the data that we're using, so I'll swap the chart type before connecting to Google Sheets. After authenticating with Google, I see a list of my most recently opened files, and I'll use the company growth report for this chart. And before selecting the data range, I'm going to double check the data that we have in Google Sheets just to see the range I want to use. And yeah, so I enter that, update the range, and pull the data magically into Canva. So if I want to update the chart, I can change the sheets with just a click of the button and hit update, or change the range if I wanted to, and without recreating the chart, just be able to use this. So that's all, and over to Michelle on infographic charts.
Thanks, Tyler. So we're just going to finish off today's session with a little talk about infographics, because infographics are one of our most popular design formats. So I'm going to run you through what we call our infographic charts. Now, Zoe already touched on them earlier, but we're going to go in a little bit more depth, and we're going to also get hands-on today. So we have learned a lot about, like, if you have a set of data, how can you create a really effective graph? But there may also be instances where you don't necessarily have a lot of data or big data to share, but you have like really particular statistics that you want to highlight. So it could be things like market highlights or relevant facts, or maybe something that's a bit topical like vaccine statistics. And this may be stuff that you're sharing on a more public platform like social media, or in like a flyer to share with the community. So for these cases, you may want to consider our progress and our pictogram charts. These are what we call our infographic charts. Originally, they were actually created for our not-for-profit users, but they've actually turned out to be pretty popular amongst all of our users. So as Zoe mentioned before, these are for percentage-based statistics. In terms of the progress charts, they come in 4 formats. We've got rings, bars, radials, and dials. And then we also have pictograms, which you can customize with a selection of icons. So just a quick tip before we get into the demo. Think about the purpose of your statistics before choosing one of these infographic charts. So are you trying to draw attention to like a very specific fact, or are you trying to compare statistics with one another? So rings and pictograms tend to be really good for standalone statistics, like you can see at the top of the infographic and at the top of that presentation. When these are like the center of attention, you know, standalone facts that you want to share. But if you have stats that you want to present in a more comparative way, then you may want to consider laying your charts out in like by stacking some bars on top of one another, or even laying them out in like a dashboard. Okay, but we're going to get into the demo. So today I have got this infographic here, and we're going to like jazz it up a bit with some of our charts. If you want to follow along, we'll pop a link to a template in the chat and you can try it out yourself with me. So this infographic, it's a hypothetical progress report for some plastic elimination campaign. And this organization is telling us that they want to eliminate plastic from their supply chain. They've given us like some stats that so far they've had 62% of apparel materials now made from recycled fibers, 45% of plastic footwears are now also recycled, and 95% of plastic bags are recycled or made from paper. Down the bottom, we've got two more stats. They've reduced their water consumption by 70%, and 88% of water from the offices are recycled. It's pretty good of an infographic, but it is like pretty text heavy. So what I'm actually going to do is I am going to replace each of these stats with one of our progress charts and hopefully make the infographic look a lot more visually interesting and engaging. So to add a chart, you will have already seen from Tyler's demo, but just to recap, you just go to the sidebar on the left and you'll see a tab that says charts. If you don't see this in your editor, you might want to look at the more section and you'll find it there. And then you can see the selection of charts that we have. Before we do this, I'm just going to duplicate this so that I'll use the first one as a reference and I'll work out of the second. And I might just also remove some text so I have a bit more room to play with. Okay, I'm going to add a progress bar. I think it would be nice because we've got these like 3 dot points here. I think it'd be nice to kind of stack those bars on top of one another. So I've added a progress bar. You can easily customize all of our charts, especially with color, with font. So I'm going to change the colors to match my, like the look of my design. And for our progress charts, you also have the option of toggling the labels on and off. I think here it's quite particular, like the statistics are quite particular. So I'm going to keep the label, but I'm going to just change the font and the color so that, you know, it's a bit more visible and maybe make it bold so it stands out a bit more. Cool. And then I'll just adjust the size a bit. So other customizations you can do, you can adjust the line thickness or the line width, you know, according to your own design aesthetic, I guess, or the look that you're going for. I'm happy with something like that. You can also choose whether you want the endpoints to be round or flat. Again, it's just a matter of your aesthetic preference. And I might just adjust the font size because it was a bit big. Cool. Okay, so that is my chart. Oh, and then of course I need to adjust the actual value. And I'm going to bring back some text just so we actually know what the chart is referring to. And I'll just copy and paste that. And I want my text to match, so I'm just going to use the copy paste roller, maybe just adjust the size, maybe fixing up the styling a little bit, just so it's a little bit more discreet and the actual chart like speaks through. And that's the first chart. Now, once we've got the first chart, it's really easy then for us to just kind of duplicate it and adjust it to the other 2 stats. So I'll show you how to do that. And I might just move everything up so you have a bit more room. So I've got my chart and my text. I can easily duplicate it. And then I'll just go in and adjust the numbers. So I believe this one was 45%. And I'll take the text and copy and paste. And then this one was 95%. 95. Cool. And that's those 3 done. Personally, I think that this is a lot more like the stats really speak out a lot more than when they were just in dot point form. Now for the last 2, I am going to actually use a progress ring, which is this one here. But I'll show you what you can do with our progress charts. You can easily interchange them between the different shapes. If you want to just, you know, try them out and see what they look like. And I'll just change the color so the white doesn't blend in there. But I'm going to go with the ring today. So I'll add my ring, move to the side, maybe adjust the thickness, bring the font back, adjust the value, and then bring back some text. So this was a 70% reduction in water consumption. And then the last statistic here, which is 88% of water from our offices are recycled. For this one, I'm going to use a pictogram, which is the icon chart. So I'll bring that in. You can see there's a whole bunch of different icons to choose from, like baby, hand, person. I'm going to use the water droplet today. It's because we're talking about water related stats, so it's pretty on trend or on brand. And then I will just adjust, how many icons I want. I can also adjust how many icons I want per row. I'm happy with something like that. I'll fix up the styling a bit. The stat was 88%, so I'll just adjust it to roughly be about 88%. And then maybe space it out a little bit. Just fixing up the colors. Yep. And then add some text, which again, I'll just copy and paste. And that's that. So this is the before of the infographic, and that is the after. So you can see that just by adding a few simple charts, we've really lifted the stats, and they now speak a lot more through the text. And I think what I'll do now is I will pass back over to Jess to wrap us up.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Michelle. That's a really beautiful looking infographic. Michelle in the chat is saying, can you teach creativity too, please? Because that chart looked really beautiful. So yeah. So here's an invitation for you. Get making. We would love to see anything that you do use all our pictograms and charts on. And here's a hashtag. If you share it on your socials, you can hashtag made in Canva so we can get to check it out. We've had a fantastic series of workshops for startups this week, and we have this resources hub to summarize all of the materials and templates and things mentioned throughout the 4 workshops this week. So you'll find professional template kits, prototype kits made especially for startups, as well as more info on why now is a great time to set up your team on Canva, because we've got this new Canva Pro 5-for-1 team pricing. So I'll pop that link in the chat right now as well. That is canva.com/solutions/startups. So as mentioned a few times, this was the 4th in a series of workshops for startups. If you did miss out on signing up to those other workshops, not to worry. All the webinars from this week, including this one, will be shared via email to everyone who registered. But after that, we'll be posting them to our YouTube channel once they've been emailed out. So be sure to follow Canva's YouTube channel so you're notified as soon as they do come out. And if you'd like to join us for more Canva webinars, this is the place to go. Here you can go and find a regular schedule of events covering a wide variety of topics, from Canva skills to soft skills such as branding and social media marketing. designschool.canva.com/events. Check it out to see what's coming up in the month ahead. I think that wraps up our session today. So we hope to see you at another Canva Space webinar very soon. Goodbye.